Welcome to Protecting Human Rights in Times of Protest and Uprising. Today we'll be talking about documenting and reporting human rights violations to the United Nations. This webinar is being presented by the Advocates for Human Rights. Hi, I'm Madeline Lohman, Senior Researcher at the Advocates for Human Rights.
I'm Amy Bergquist, Senior Staff Attorney with the International Justice Program at the Advocates for Human Rights.
The Advocates for Human Rights is a nonprofit that's been around for well over 30 years. We work to make international human rights a reality in people's lives, both here in the United States and around the globe. We focus on a couple key issue areas: protecting the rights of immigrants and refugees, ending violence against women, abolishing the death penalty, working with human rights defenders to teach them how to do documentation, UN advocacy, communications, and other key human rights skills, and educating and training people on human rights worldwide. So this presentation is going to be drawn from two resources that the Advocates for Human Rights has created so that activists around the world can use human rights methods and standards in their work. One of them is called Human Rights Tools for a Changing World, which offers a step-by-step guide to fact-finding, documentation, and advocacy. And the other is a training and manual called Discover Human Rights, a human rights approach to social justice work. So you can get both of these on our website, theadvocatesforhumanrights.org/manuals. So today we're going to be talking about a couple things. The first is identifying government actions during protests and other times of unrest as human rights violations, documenting and reporting those human rights violations to the United Nations, and then using those reports for further advocacy. And so really maximizing the impact of our engagement with the United Nations. So right now we are in a moment where we are seeing a lot of public protest and public demonstration after the death of George Floyd at the hands of the police. People have been speaking out about police brutality and about racism in the United States in really massive movements that have taken place in every state. There's been widely varying law enforcement responses to those protests, some of which have been extremely disproportionate and possibly in violation of international human rights standards. So we're seeing people detained and injured and communities threatened by violence because of law enforcement responses. So we also have a lot of people who are documenting what's happening. We have eyewitness accounts, videos, photographs from people who are really bringing what's happening to light. And all of these are combining into a moment where we can use international human rights to advance the causes that we care about, especially police brutality, anti-racism, and the right to free expression. So when we think about human rights, we are hoping that by adhering to international human rights standards, we can guarantee that people enjoy dignity, freedom, equality, justice, and peace. So those 5 words come out of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's the entire reason that countries around the world have written international treaties and agreements to defend human rights, is to try to guarantee those things for everyone, no matter where they live and no matter any of their demographic characteristics: race, language, gender, age, ability. And so that's what we want to keep foregrounded when we're thinking about what we're doing, is we're really looking to achieve those 5 goals. To do that, we want to follow a human rights approach. So a human rights approach is taking a really specific look at how we create change. So on the right, we see this ideal cycle in which someone who has human rights, an individual rights holder, wants to improve their situation, wants to enjoy more of their human rights. And they make a claim against governments or businesses or community institutions that are responsible for upholding human rights. Those responsible authorities in an ideal world then make changes. They change laws, they change institutions, they change economic systems, they change cultural practices. And those changes in structures improve people's lives and human rights are better realized. So that's what would happen in an ideal world. We don't see that happening routinely in the United States or anywhere. We are living in an imperfect world. So what can we do from a human rights perspective? And from a human rights perspective, we really want to intervene in two key places. One is that we want to make it easier for individuals to demand their rights. And that can take a lot of forms. Sometimes people don't know what their rights are. Sometimes people don't have the resources to take action. Sometimes people are in fear of what will happen to them if they take action. And so we want to address whatever is making it difficult for people to claim their rights. And then we also want to hold accountable governments and other institutions that should be improving the human rights situation. And we can help them in places where they want to take action by giving them information and training and skills. We can also put pressure on them in places where they don't want to take action so that they feel compelled to do something because of public outcry or pressure from other governments. So those are the two places that we really want to act to make this cycle work. So when we look at that cycle, that turns into 4 key strategies. We would start with making sure that rights holders can claim their rights. So we want to empower rights holders, empower individuals to take action. We also, as I mentioned, want to make responsible authorities more accountable. So we want to work with them either in a collaborative, cooperative way when they want that, or in something that is more putting pressure on them and holding them accountable when they are not upholding their human rights. We also want to make sure that we're looking at changing the structures. We don't want to address a human rights issue and say, you know, in this protest, for instance, someone was harmed by a non-lethal projectile and therefore we want to get them hospital care. That may be true. We may want to get them hospital care, but we also want to change the structure that means police officers resort to force in situations where they don't have to, and where the only way to see meaningful change in how law enforcement treats people of color is through massive social protest. Both of those things are structural problems. And so we want to address the root causes of those structural problems. And then finally, we want to improve people's lives. We want to protect marginalized groups who are the most serious risk of human rights violations and make sure that they can fully realize their human rights. So we're looking at these 4 strategies, and that's what we're trying to take action on. So when we're thinking about documenting human rights violations, we want to think about these 4 strategies as we go. How does our documentation empower people, hold people accountable, look at the structural issues, and specifically seek to protect marginalized groups? So what's happening on the ground? We're seeing lots of things happening during protests that are problematic. We see people being arrested without cause by people who are not marked as particular government agents, people being harmed by non-lethal projectiles, protests being responded to by tear gas, that is also physically harmful. So all of this is happening. And one of the things that we want to do is try to connect these things that are happening to international human rights. So we're talking about how human rights can make a difference. How can we bridge what's happening on the ground with the international human rights system? So Amy, this is your area of expertise. You are the person who reports to the United Nations on all sorts of human rights violations around the world. How would you connect what's happening on the ground to international human rights?
Well, the first thing we want to do is look at what international human rights standards say about what's going on. So we use the international human rights standards as sort of this guide in terms of how to frame how we describe what's happening. And these international standards, we'll go into a little bit more detail about them, but there's a good reason for drawing on international human rights standards rather than looking specifically at a statute or at the Constitution of the United States. And that is that the way in which law enforcement authorities have been responding in the United States isn't unique to the United States. We see protests in every corner of the world and very similar tactics being deployed by law enforcement and security forces in other countries as well. So drawing on these international human rights standards helps reveal the commonalities of the government responses and of the human rights that are at stake, because human rights apply to people in the United States and to people all around the world. They're universal. So using these international human rights standards shows that the US response isn't unique and sort of shows the commonalities in the repressive tactics that are being used around the world. For example, when people are arrested and then released in the United States, they have to sign off that they won't engage in further protest. That's something that also happens in Ethiopia. When people are engaging in peaceful protests, they're arrested, detained, they're never charged with a crime, but they're required to sign a waiver of further protest in order to be released from prison. So it's drawing on these international human rights standards shows these commonalities. It also brings the struggle that's happening in the United States to a global perspective, and it helps not only protesters in the United States, but protesters in other countries, because it raises the visibility of these human rights violations for people who might not be able to bring attention to the United Nations of what's happening to them. And it affirms the importance of these human rights in this global perspective. So, as I said, we'll dig into what rights are being violated and how international human rights standards view these particular rights. So we'll talk in brief about this, and you don't have to be an expert about this. You don't have to be a lawyer. What your role can be is really sharing the relevant facts on the ground with the people who are experts. So think of yourselves as experts about knowing what's actually happening, and let the experts at the UN sort of sort out how that applies to the relevant international human rights standards. You don't have to be an expert in those standards, but you need to know that these standards do exist. So we'll take a look at them now. So one of the fundamental human rights standards is the right to life and right to security of the person. So the right not to be killed for participating in a protest, and the right to your physical integrity, not to face physical injury or harm because you are expressing your views, participating in a protest, or doing other things along those lines. So that's an international human rights standard that you have those rights. Other rights that may sound very familiar, they are echoed in our Bill of Rights, is the right to freedom of opinion and expression, to express your opinions, and the right to peaceful assembly, the right to association, to associate with other people to express those views or to be in solidarity with other people. So those are obviously quite relevant to the uprising that has been happening over the past few months. Then there are sort of negative rights, the right to be free from arbitrary arrest and detention. So arbitrary arrest is a sort of specified international human rights term, and there are a lot of different types of arrests that are arbitrary. One way an arrest can be arbitrary is if a person is being arrested because they are participating in a protest or because they are expressing their political opinion. The arrest in that context is arbitrary. It's not arbitrary to arrest someone who's suspected of a crime if there's probable cause to believe a crime has been committed. That's not typically arbitrary, but it's arbitrary for people to be singled out because they're expressing their views, or to be singled out because of their race or ethnicity or political opinion. That would amount to an arbitrary arrest and an arbitrary detention if they're subsequently held. Enforced disappearances, and this is something that we might associate with other countries, but an enforced disappearance can mean that you are taken off the street, thrown in an unmarked van, and not heard from for a matter of hours or a matter of days. That's a disappearance that is organized by some government forces, and we have heard reports of those things happening. So that is a human rights violation as well. You have the right to be protected from enforced disappearances. And extrajudicial killings. So extrajudicial killings are also a human rights violation. And what that means is when law enforcement or other authorities use lethal force against individuals and kill them through their use of force in that kind of a setting. So these are some of the international human rights standards that may be applicable depending on your context to what's been going on in your communities. Another overarching international human rights standard is the right to non-discrimination. So all of these rights are sort of substantive rights, and another important substantive right is that you can't be deprived of your right in a discriminatory way. So there could be restrictions on, like what we would call time, place, and manner restrictions on protests, for example, but they can't be imposed in a discriminatory way to say, okay, these people, because they are opposing the government, they have certain restrictions on their protests that other people in favor of the government don't have, because that would be discrimination based on political opinion. The non-discrimination provisions are quite broad, so they include political opinion, but also gender, race, ethnicity, religion, political opinion, as I've said, and a lot of other factors. But non-discrimination is sort of this underlying principle behind all of the human rights, is that they can't be disrespected or disregarded or restrained in a discriminatory way.
So knowing that we are seeing actual human rights violations of recognized international standards that the United States has agreed to uphold, how can we make that clear? How can we document that what we're seeing is a human rights violation?
So documentation is the key part of it. And as I alluded to before, you are the holders of the facts and the people who are best able to gather the facts on the ground. And as we'll talk about later, the United Nations wants to know what's happening on the streets, what's happening in our communities, and you are the holders of that information. So you need to document what's happening, and it's important to keep in mind, what does the United Nations want to know about? What are the facts that you want to pull together to bring to the United Nations attention? So one of the first things that is important is the names of the individual victims, those rights holders that Madeline was talking about. Who are the individual victims? Getting their names, but also relevant demographic information, what they were doing, what activities they were involved with when the human rights violations occurred. Were they involved in some kind of a protest, holding a particular sign, any sorts of details about the victims themselves that appeared to lead to or trigger the human rights violation, that will all be relevant. So focus on the victim, but also focus on the officials, because human rights violations are typically committed by government or state actors. And so we need to document who specifically engaged in the human rights violations. So you might not know the names of the officers who were involved, but you may be able to describe the uniforms, or say that this particular uniform is a uniform of a particular police department or a particular force, what kind of insignia, or if they had identification, if they had a badge. If you're able to pull together that information, that's going to be really helpful. If you're only able to say that they were wearing the uniform of a particular government entity, that's fine as well. Or if they weren't wearing a uniform, but they also engaged in law enforcement-like activities, like grabbing someone, putting them in a van, that will also be really important to document as well. Who were the officials or apparent officials who were taking the action? Then, of course, you want to describe, sort of just like a journalist would describe the setting of where all this occurred, what the time was, the date, the location, those types of details about the human rights violation. You'll want to document those facts. And then other details that may be important to painting the picture of a particular human rights violation. So if they were put not in a police squad car, but in an unmarked vehicle, if they were engaging in a peaceful sit-in or something like that when they were detained or arrested, or the extent of what their injuries were and how their injuries were caused. Was a taser involved, rubber bullets, whatever, tear gas, what types of tools or implements were used by the officials to result in the human rights violation. So keep an eye out for all of the possible relevant facts and make sure that you're documenting those about the particular incident or incidents that you're focusing on. And you may say, well, how do we go about documenting the incident? Fortunately, a lot of us are carrying in our back pocket the ability to video record incidents, and that's really important. The United Nations, however, typically will want everything reduced to words, but it's important to have at your fingertips all of the other forms of documentation so that you can preserve that evidence and then have it available if the United Nations wants to look at them further. But you can do video recordings, audio recordings. You can also interview witnesses, or perhaps you yourself are a witness and you can offer up a witness statement. It doesn't have to be anything formal. It's just describing what you saw and when. Photos can also be helpful if somebody had to seek medical attention, getting that medical documentation or medical report. And then if anyone was issued a citation or a ticket or charges or given a conditional release form, all of those documents will also be very important. So pull together all of that evidence, but with a view to, if you're going to be sharing this information with the United Nations, they generally don't want the video or photos or audio. They generally are going to want everything in writing because that makes it easier for them to process. But you can take a video and, for example, the person who made the video or a person who was there when the video was being made can watch the video and describe sort of second by second or in clumps of time what they see on the video. And then that written description can be used as part of the documentation of the incident.
We've gathered information, we've gotten video, we've written it down, we've turned it into words. And now it needs to go before the United Nations. United Nations, complicated big place, lots of different ways to give them information. What's the most helpful way if you are an individual who's witnessed or experienced a human rights violation? What's the best way to communicate that to the United Nations?
One of the simplest ways to communicate an incident of a human rights violation that seems to be part of a broader pattern is to communicate with what are called the special procedures at the United Nations. And the special procedures at the United Nations are a really flexible way to get the word out. They are independent experts who act on complaints of human rights violations. And so you share with them what the human rights violation was that happened to you or somebody you know or somebody you're working with, and then they will communicate what the allegations were that you've sent to them. They will communicate that to your government. So they act as this intermediary between you and the government actors who violated your rights. So it's actually a pretty straightforward procedure that we will walk through, but they are a really flexible mechanism, so you don't have to have special jurisdiction or anything. They want to know about what's happening on the ground. They want your facts and information so that they can use their human rights lens to take a look at them and see if there has been a human rights violation and to ask for a response from the government. So here we're going to show you some of the different special procedures, and the special procedures at the United Nations generally are focused on particular themes or particular issue areas. So there are several different working groups, and a working group is a kind of special procedure. There are working groups that we selected here for this presentation that are particularly relevant to what's been happening with the protests and the uprising and the response or crackdown on those protests. So there's a working group on arbitrary detention, and I talked about arbitrary detention a bit earlier. So they focus on a lot of different kinds of arbitrary detention, but including detention of people based on their expression of their political opinion. So that would be one special procedure you could consider reaching out to. There's also a working group on enforced or involuntary disappearances. So again, to the extent that people were thrown in unmarked vans, taken away, their family members weren't notified of their whereabouts, they weren't given access to counsel, they would be a relevant target audience. There's also a working group on people of African descent. So looking at issues related to race and systemic racism in the United States, they may also be interested in the human rights violations that have been happening here in the United States. But working groups are just one kind of special procedure. There's also a special procedure called a special rapporteur. And a special rapporteur is just an individual expert, a one-person special procedure rather than a working group. And there are special rapporteurs on a lot of different topics, so we've just selected a few of them that might be relevant here. There's a special rapporteur on extrajudicial executions. There's one that focuses on freedom of opinion and expression, another focusing on the right to assemble and right to association. There's also a special rapporteur on human rights defenders, and that might not be a term that you're familiar with, but a human rights defender is somebody who is on the ground sticking up for human rights. So if you're protesting because of systemic racism or protesting because of police violence, you are a human rights defender. And there's a special rapporteur whose job is to look into human rights violations against people who are human rights defenders. So think of all of yourselves as human rights defenders. That's definitely a go-to special rapporteur for a lot of what's happening. There is also a special rapporteur on minority issues, and minority issues are defined broadly. There's also a special rapporteur on racism and racial discrimination, and a special rapporteur on torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. And so that might have to do with the use of less lethal weapons in response to protesters, like rubber bullets, and the use of tear gas, etc. Other incidents of law enforcement violence against protesters, for example.
So knowing that there's all of these different special rapporteurs, it seems like it could be a sort of intimidating process to try to figure out how to get the information to them and how to make sure that it's compelling. But I think one of the things working with Amy that I've learned is that it's not actually that intimidating. So I think you can walk us through, Amy, some of the basics of the process. And then for people who really want more detail, we do have an absolutely step-by-step guide to making a submission.
Yeah, that's right. And the special procedures at the United Nations, they want to have an accessible system. They want anyone, regardless, they don't have to have training as a lawyer or as specialized training in human rights or international human rights. They want anyone who is aggrieved because of some human rights violation to be able to share that information with them. So they try to make it as easy as possible. They don't always succeed in making it easy, but it's generally meant to be an accessible system. And what we call this system is a communications system. And a communication is essentially a letter that one of these special procedures sends to the government. Usually it might sometimes be a business. And this letter will summarize what the allegations are of the incident of a human rights violation, and they'll request information. They'll request a response. They'll request additional details. And these communications typically will focus on past human rights violations, things that have happened relatively recently, or ongoing human rights violations, things that are expected to be an imminent human rights violations. Sometimes they'll also focus on draft laws or existing laws or policies that have human rights violations sort of baked into them. All of those things are fair game for these communications, and the communications are what the special procedures, those independent experts, send to the government. But in order for them to send something to the government, they need to have the information from all of you. So what's the purpose of these communications? So the special procedures don't have sort of their own law enforcement to go and force the government to do what they say. It's really more of a diplomatic procedure. You'll see a couple of examples in just a moment. But going to the United Nations, first and foremost, raises visibility about the existence of these human rights violations. It's not just happening in your community, it's something you are sending to the United Nations. It raises the visibility of what's happening, of what those human rights violations are. There's also the possibility of remedies, because the special procedures will communicate to the government and they will ask for a response. They'll ask the government to look into it. And in some cases, the government may be able to come up with some type of a remedy in responding to the special procedures. And the special procedures in some cases will recommend certain remedies to respond to what the alleged human rights violations are. And they're also a way to raise public awareness. You know, it's one thing to say that the police were using rubber bullets and I got hurt, look at all these bruises all over my body, but it's another thing to say, I submitted this complaint, or we as a community, this group of victims of rubber bullets, all together submitted a communication, submitted a complaint to the United Nations Special Procedures, and that was submitted to our government requesting a response. So it raises public awareness of these human rights violations, and also raises awareness of the commonalities between the human rights violations in the United States and human rights violations around the world. So there are good reasons to engage in this communication process that go beyond your individual human rights issues. So what's the process? The first step in the process is the victim or a witness or an organization that is working with the victim or a witness submits information to the special procedure. The special procedure will take a look at that information and then communicate to the government. And then the government is expected to provide a response. That's all there is. There's no trial. There's no verdict. It's just a back and forth between the special procedure and the government, and everything gets published. So that's all there is to it. So you might say, well, I'm not getting any monetary rewards. I'm not getting any damages. I'm not getting any verdict. What's in it for me? But again, it's about raising visibility and showing the commonality of these human rights violations. So it's a way to raise awareness about the situation and to invoke those international human rights standards. Criteria. So what will make for a good submission to one of these special procedures? First of all is the facts. So you need to have detailed facts of the alleged violations of human rights. The facts need to be based on credible and detailed information. They do want you to go into a good level of detail about what happened. Avoiding abusive language. Well, the special procedures are independent experts. They try to avoid charged language. They generally are communicating with the governments in very diplomatic terms, and you'll be more persuasive with them if you yourself are not using abusive language to describe the people who violated your human rights. The information you submit shouldn't be exclusively based on media reports. You can use media reports as corroborating evidence, but there should be at least some firsthand evidence as well. The communication shouldn't be manifestly unfounded or politically motivated. Now, politically motivated, of course, there's a lot of political motivation to what's going on, and so you read that as you're not submitting the communication as a way to achieve some political ends. You're using the communication process to raise visibility about human rights violations. And they can be submitted by an individual, a group, an organization, or a national human rights body. We don't have one of those here in the United States, or an intergovernmental entity. But you as individuals can submit information to the special procedure so that they can do a communication.
So I just want to clarify a little bit here, Amy, is that, you know, I, for instance, have mostly been seeing reports of what's been happening on the news, or sometimes someone that I follow on Facebook or Twitter will say something about something that happened to them. But then I also have friends who have been at protests where things have happened and have seen or experienced themselves a human rights violation. So can we talk about, when would someone who is mostly seeing things through media reports or through sort of second or third hand reports, is this the kind of thing that they should be using to report? Or is it really for people who were on the ground or directly connected to someone on the ground?
It's really the latter. So it's for people who are directly involved with the human rights violations or know someone directly. And you might not have been involved in the protest, but you know someone, and you could reach out to them, say, hey, I heard about this way to bring to the attention of the United Nations these human rights violations that were happening. Do you want to work together and do this? You could actually be of assistance to them, getting the information from them that they saw firsthand, adding the credible media sources, media reports as well, and pulling that all together for them. So it's a way, if you weren't on the front lines or if you aren't on the front lines, you can still be an ally to take that information and get it to the United Nations. But as we'll talk about, you also need consent of the victim. So if you're just getting your reports from the media, you're probably not going to be able to have that direct communication with a victim. And so think about that as sort of the leading point. Do you know, can you get permission from a particular victim to go forward with it? And if your level of information is just what you see on Facebook and what you see on, from the media reports, then you're probably not going to be able to drill down to get to a particular victim. So let that sort of guide you in terms of whether this is an appropriate step to take.
Thank you. That's very clear. So I think we now have some screenshots of the actual form that people use to send information in. And maybe if you could just walk through a little bit. So how much of this do I have to fill out? How much, is it okay if I guess at something or leave it blank? That would be great to know.
Yeah, there's an online form for submitting your information to the special procedures, and it's a form there. We're doing a longer recording that takes you sort of step by step, page by page through the form, but we'll just give you a little bit of a taste of it here. And it's a form that once you start, you have 24 hours to complete. So it's a good idea to know all the information that you need before you jump in and start your account and all of that. But the first thing that you want to think about is what issues, themes, or areas is your complaint related to. And these are all the different special procedures that exist. There are a lot more than we've already mentioned. So there's a specific one that focuses on albinism, probably not relevant to most of the events in the uprising that's been happening in the United States, but there are human rights violations related to people with albinism, and so there's a special procedure for that. So there's this big long list, and you can choose up to 5 of these different areas of concern. And so think strategically about what are the most relevant 5 or fewer of the issues or themes that are on the list. And we've compiled a list of all of them in the handout where you can see all the different of the big long list. There are more than 40 different special procedures to choose from. So think about what those areas are. Then, as we've mentioned, think about the victims. You have to provide information. You have to identify the victim. And all the starred things on the form are required information. So you have to provide the name of the victim if the victim is a person, as opposed to a group, like a religious community or something like that. And they ask for demographic information about the victim as well. The reason for collecting all of this information about the victims is they need to give the government a chance to respond. And if you don't tell the government who the victim is, then the government may say, well, we have no way to look into this, to do an investigation of it, because we don't know who the person is who's alleged to be, who have been arrested or injured, etc. So they do emphasize under most circumstances, they need to have the name of the victim, and that name of the victim will be shared with the government. So make sure you have that information at hand. This is additional information that's optional that you can provide about the victim, various demographic data. Also, you'll see the drop down for affiliation or activity, and this is the these are the different choices. So participation in a peaceful assembly might be the activity that the person was involved with if they were, subjected to less lethal force, or subjected to an arbitrary arrest as after their participation in a peaceful protest. So what happens to a submission? You fill out that form, you click submit, and what happens next? So this online form is sent to the relevant special procedures, the 1 to 5 of the topics that you selected at the first part of the form, and they have staff members who are responsible for going through the information that's been submitted. They may get back to you and request additional information. They may say, okay, you've said this, can you give us more information about, looking for some additional details. And it's important to note that not all submissions actually become communications. They don't all get communicated to the government. There might be a variety of reasons that they don't have enough time, that maybe they are looking at, maybe based on the Portland protests, for example, maybe they've received 20 different communications, and maybe they just want to choose some representative communications to send along to the US government rather than sending all 20. So don't feel bad if you submit that information and then you don't hear back and it doesn't become a communication. It might be that they're deciding to focus on other victims or other incidents. But generally speaking, the communications to the government remain confidential for 60 days. So everything will be on the down low at that point. Although it's your communication, you can share information about it because you're in charge. So you can share that information as soon as you click submit on the website. And then you can also check the database. There's a database of all the communications that have been submitted for every country in the world, for every mechanism at the UN. there's a great database. You can go and take a look at everything that's been submitted, and then after 60 days, see if yours has gone public. And you can keep checking and taking a look to see if yours is there. And then the transmitted communications, the ones that have been sent to the government, are published in a report that happens 3 times a year that compiles all the communications that have been sent to from all the different special procedures to all the different countries in the world. And that report goes to the Human Rights Council 3 times a year. So you can also look in that Human Rights Council report as well to see what's in there.
So I think now we're going to walk through some examples, and maybe you can just tell us what we're looking at, Amy.
Sure. So this is the most recent report that I was just mentioning, that 3 times a year there's a report of all the communications to the Human Rights Council. This one was submitted in June of 2020. And all of the different special procedures pull together all of their information, and it's all compiled in one handy dandy report that summarizes everything that all the special procedures have done. So think about all the different human rights issues all around the world, all in one spot over a relevant period. So this is in that report. It gives all the countries that have received communications and what's happened to them over this particular period. The United States received 4 communications, replied to 1 of the 4, and that's what we have. So we'll take a look at a little bit more information about those 4 communications that were part of this June report. So here you see, this is all from the report. You'll see these 4 communications, and the next column is the mandates. And so those are the different topic areas, the one where you choose up to 5. And you'll see the first one, they chose all 5, and the other 3, they chose just 1. That's a strategic decision you can make. But then it also gives a summary of what the issues are in the communication. So the first one has to do with people who were detained in Connecticut, and it talks about the use of in-cell restraints, prolonged solitary confinement, denial of appropriate treatment for psychosocial disabilities, and that it has had a severe physical and psychological impact on at least 15 persons who have been incarcerated at this particular place in Connecticut. And you can click, you see there's an opportunity to click more details for each one, and that will give the more detailed information about the victims. For example, these are the 15 people who are the alleged victims in that communication in Connecticut. And that is all public information. So those individuals have to have agreed to share their name, to share their information. There may be more than 15 persons, but only these 15 agreed to have their names shared in this communication. And it's fine to have just 1 or 2 representatives of a larger group, as long as you have permission and the name of at least 1 victim who's willing to go forward. So you'll see that this is the text of the actual communication, what those special procedures sent to the government of the United States. And you'll see excellency, it's using very diplomatic language. We have the honor to address you in our capacities, blah, blah, blah. In this connection, we'd like to bring to your attention information we've received concerning, and then here are the human rights violations that have been alleged. And it summarizes the information that they received about the human rights violation. And you know, this was from February of 2020. And so it goes on, and then at the very end, the communication will request information, explain what you're doing to provide reasonable accommodation to people who have psychosocial disabilities. What steps have you just taken to limit solitary confinement? And provide information on steps taken to implement recommendations from this Department of Justice report about the use of restrictive housing. And then at the very end, it says this communication and any response will be made public within 60 days. So 60 days going forward from the date of that communication in February 2020, then it becomes public, and any response, and it's also made available in the report to the Human Rights Council and on the website. So they give the government notice, like, we're going public with this, we'll give you 60 days to give your response, but this is going public regardless of whether you respond. This is going to be an official document available to anyone in the world who wants to take a look at it. So that's the communication. Now you'll see that only one of those had a response, and this is a piece of the response from a different communication during the same period. about the death of a journalist in South Sudan. And so this is the only one the government of the United States responded to over the relevant period. But you'll see that they're saying we're very committed to protecting journalists and they're very important. We've forwarded the communication. We're really engaged in this case. We thank you for your efforts and the mandate and all of that. So not necessarily what you would expect, but they're saying, you know, we really think this mandate is very important, and you know, we're really concerned about this journalist as well. So all in all, a relatively positive response as opposed to the non-responses for the other communications. But that's sort of what you can expect. There might be no response from the government. There might be something enthusiastic or something in between.
So you spent a lot of time, I think, talking about victims and their names and the fact that that will be made public. And I think we're just really going to emphasize that here for a minute because it's one of the key factors in making a communication.
Yeah, and it will ask, you know, do you have consent of the victim? Can we use their victim's name? And typically, if the victim doesn't allow their name to be shared with the government, then the special procedures' hands are tied. They can't really do much because they need to give the government a chance to investigate and look into the details. And if they don't have a name, it's really hard for the government officials to give a response. So the victims will be named in the communications. That's why you need to have their express consent. And there are really very limited exceptions if the victim is a minor, if there are allegations of sexual abuse, or if there are really, really serious security concerns. But generally speaking, the special procedures won't move forward unless they have the consent of the victim. And the victim's name will be shared with the government. In some cases, the victim's name won't be included in that report that goes to the public. Sometimes if it's a minor, they'll use initials instead of the full name, but the name will generally be shared with the government so that the government can respond, even if the victim's name isn't shared in those public-facing documents. So as we've said, the special procedures require victim consent, and this is another screenshot from the online form. You have to check the box saying that you have the consent of the alleged victim, whether you are the victim and you give your consent, you're representing the victim, or you're a family member of the victim. The victim may have been killed or maybe disappeared, and so you need to, in that case, have the consent of the family members of the victim. Or if the victim, if it's impossible to get the consent, if the victim has disappeared, they're subject to an enforced disappearance, then you may be able to say that you can't give consent. And you see over on the right-hand side on the website, they give a lot of details about noting that what happens with the identity of the victim. So they give you all of this information so you can make an informed decision about whether to name a victim and whether to go forward with the complaint. How much time does the process take? There are urgent cases, and urgent cases are typically where there's some imminent human rights violation, like a person is scheduled to be executed in the next week or so. And in those cases, the staff that sort of work behind the scenes and doing the intake may take some initial steps within 24 hours. But generally speaking, the special procedures might take a month or even more than a month to prepare their letter, their communication to the government. And then, as we've said, after the transmittal of the communication, there's a 60-day period where the government has its chance to get its response in. And then it becomes public for everyone to see. And I did some looking under the current administration at the communications that the current administration has received. They have responded in about 37% of cases, so not a particularly high response rate, but the average time for their response has been 89 days. So it might be, you know, that 60-day period has expired, so the communication is public. They may take a bit longer, another month or so, to get their response submitted. And the response ultimately will be, if they respond, it will ultimately be put on in that public database and be available for everyone to see. So how to file a submission? As we said, there's going to be a separate training about that, but there is an online form at the link that you see on your screen, and you have 24 hours to complete the form after you open a case. And you can always, if you don't have enough time and you just want to poke through it, you can just not submit it at the end. You can go through and take a look at what the different questions are, gather your information, and then start with a fresh submission when you have everything ready as well.
So I think knowing the details of how to get the information in the United Nations. And Amy's talked a lot about the process, but also the point of the process. Sort of, it's this very diplomatic process. We're not going to see anyone arrested by the United Nations. And you know, we may not even see the United States government making a response. So why are we engaging here? And Amy's talked a lot about that, but I think we just want to reiterate that, first of all, we are building a bigger picture. We're gathering all of these different incidents. If people start making these reports from all over the United States, that's a really comprehensive picture of the ways in which freedom of expression is under threat in our country. And it's a really comprehensive picture that's going to get compiled and analyzed and put out in the public by a really reputable, objective observer, which is the United Nations, who's going to get all this information and bring it together. Another thing that it does, which I think can be hard to remember in the moment, is that it creates a historical record. So very often in the aftermath of serious human rights violations, when people want to reckon with what's happened, it can be really difficult to figure out who was responsible, what was the chain of command, what was the impact on individuals. And the more we collect and record and report what's happening, the more we have that record to be able to say, this happened because of these individuals who are in charge, or these laws that allow the police to behave a certain way. And this helps us create an understanding of the systems that make our rights under threat. And so we really want to build that historical record, and this is a way to do that through this United Nations process. And it helps us in the United States, but it also, as Amy points out, helps people all over the world, because it's a historical record of how all governments have responded to this. And we've been talking about it from the US point of view, but if you're in another country that has also seen protests or uprisings about police reform, because that hasn't just happened here, this is a process for you too. And so we can all be contributing to this. And then finally, it forces the government to respond or to publicly not respond to an allegation. And that can be worth something, to say, the government actually had an obligation to write back, and they are so embarrassed or unable to account for what they've done that they couldn't say anything. And if you're an individual protester and the government doesn't respond to your protest or your demands, that can look a little bit bad. It can obviously be really frustrating from the protester point of view, but it doesn't have the same weight as the government blew off these independent experts whose job it is to talk to them. It really highlights how little they can justify what they've done if they're not even able to respond to a UN communication that, as Amy points out, is the most diplomatic way they're ever going to get asked about this. And so that's something that we can really use as a tool to sort of shame the government into what they've done here, that you couldn't even justify this to this diplomat from the United Nations. So how can you keep up this behavior? And then finally, it raises awareness both of the violations that are happening and of the fact that we have these rights. And these rights don't come from the Bill of Rights, from the US federal government, that, you know, if the administration decides to, you know, write a new executive order, they can change how we enjoy these rights. These rights come from international standards that we agree on globally and that we are committed to globally. And so the government can't change that. The US government can't take away our right to freedom of expression. They can't redefine it. They can't change away our right to the security of person. They can't redefine that. And so we can rely on those standards, and this raises awareness of that. This raises awareness of the fact that the government can't define away our right to be in the streets, our right to be free of police violence, and everyone should know that. And so this helps raise awareness two directions, of the violations and of the rights. So Amy, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add about the point of making these reports, or, you know, after a decade plus of doing this, how easy it is, and don't be intimidated, but we just want to make sure people know that they can access this process.
Yeah, I just encourage you to try it out and share the information you have about what's going on the ground with the experts in Geneva. They want to know from you what's happening. I'm sure they've heard about it in the news, and they're waiting for people to come to them with this sort of formal application of information so that they can take action on it. So they really do want to hear from you and take advantage of the form that's available and the opportunity to share that information with the UN so that they can do that next step. It's a great way to raise visibility for all of the reasons Madeline just provided. And it's a great additional tool in the toolbox of holding our government accountable for its human rights obligations.
So thank you all for listening to Amy and I's presentation here. And we will, as Amy mentioned, also have a very step-by-step guide to completing the submission. But don't feel like you have to listen to that whole thing to be able to make a submission. We also have a PDF of those screenshots so that you can see the information that you're going to need to collect in advance, and then you can just take it from there. It's a pretty straightforward process. But if you want the backup, we will have the step-by-step instructions. So thank you all for joining us, and best of luck upholding human rights.
Thanks.